Hello and welcome to a new Leela game from Chess.com's CCC 9 event. This was a very beautifully executed Kingside attack against Wasp in the Grünfeld Defense. The game started with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, knight c3, and now with d5 we enter the Grünfeld. Alternatively, black can play here d6 or castles and go into a King's Indian, but in this game we have d5. And one thing to remember if you play the Grünfeld, or if you want to play the Grünfeld, is to play d5 only after white played knight c3, because if you do it one move earlier instead of bishop g7, then white can take, and after knight takes and e4, this knight has to retreat, and he doesn't have good squares to retreat to. Neither b6 or f6 are satisfactory, and white would stand very well. Or alternatively, if black would take here with the queen, then white can play knight c3, the queen has to go back, and again e4, and white stands excellently. He threatens here to get in e5 at some point, and white's position is very good. So after knight c3 and d5, the situation is different, because now after c takes on d5 and knight takes and e4, black doesn't need to retreat with the knight, he can take on c3. And after b takes on c3, we arrive at the starting position of the Grünfeld Exchange. The Grünfeld defense is a hyper-modern defense, which means that black allows white to have a very strong pawn center here, and then it tries to attack it from the flanks with flankered bishops and flank pawns and the knights and so on. And one particularity of the Grünfeld defense is that this pawn on d4 after something like c5 can't really take or go forward, because this pawn on c3 is hanging and the bishop could take it with check and then take the rook on a1. So the pawn on d4 cannot move, and black will attack it with everything he has, and white needs to defend it. And this is what Leela does here. She played now bishop e3. And here Wasp could have continued with knight c6 to put even more pressure on d4, or play bishop g4 to attack the defender of the d4 pawn, but here Wasp chose to play queen a5, which is another idea in the Grünfeld, and that is to pin this pawn on c3 and not allow it to recapture on d4. And for example, after something like bishop e2, black could take here on d4 and force white to take back with the piece. And if this happens, then black is the one that has won the opening battle, because now the pawn on c3 would be an isolated pawn. So after queen a5, Leela played here queen d2 to break this pin. And here Wasp continued with castles, and now we have rook c1. The rook defends the pawn on c3 and allows this pawn on d4 to advance. And this is another idea of the Grünfeld. White is trying to remove everything from this diagonal so that this bishop on g7 doesn't have anything to attack. And here after bishop g4 now we have d5. One thing that white almost never does is to take here on c5 with this pawn. That would be nonsense, because then white not only ruins his own pawn center, but it also allows this rook to attack down the d5. This would be complete nonsense from white. But after bishop g4, Leela played d5, and as I mentioned, she wants to play c4, and she would have a very nice pawn center here with these three pawns. Now Wasp tried to stop that, and he played knight a6. Now if white would play here c4, then this knight could land on b4, and this would be a very good position for black. The point is that Wasp would want to play here b6 to defend this pawn on c5, and then win down this pawn on a2. And the queen could not be harassed with the rook, because remember, this bishop is attacking down this diagonal. Black would be much better. One thing that white could try here is to actually play a3 and force queen takes on a3 and then take on c5. But after a5, defending the knight, black would be still much better here. For example, after bishop takes on e7, black has bishop b2, and Black is I think winning here, attacking this rook on c1. The rook would have to basically go to c2, and after knight takes we check, queen takes, black has queen takes on e7, and after queen takes on b2 he would take on e4 with check. And this is clearly not a position that white is aiming for. This is not great. So after knight a6, c4 not being an option anymore, Leela thought, okay, no problem, it's time to attack the black king, and she played h4. And this is a bit surprising because her king is still in the center and this bishop is also back home. But apparently the central pawns give enough stability of the center so that she can attack on the flanks. And this is not a new idea, this actually has been played by humans before, and one game that stands out is Kramnik's win against Fiddler in 2009 in this line. Very nice game. The game continued now with h5. Wasp doesn't want to allow this pawn to advance to h5, and now came knight g5. The point of the move is that this bishop on g4 doesn't really have squares. He can't go to h5 or h3. Of course can't go to f3. He can go to f5 or e6. The only two squares left for him are d7 and c8. So Leela wants to play here f3 and send him back. And one thing to note here is that f6 doesn't really work because this weakens black's kingside very much, especially the g6 square. And then after f3, if f takes on g5 and f takes on g4, white's position is much better. The game could continue with g takes on h4 since this pawn is now attacked 3 times. And after g takes on h5 and bishop e5, h takes on g6, bishop g3 check, and king d1, actually the white king is much safer than the black king. And we can just imagine this queen coming to h6 and threatening mate, that white's position is just much better here. So after knight g5, Wasp preferred to play here rook d8, and after f3 allow this bishop to retreat gracefully to c8, where it's not bothering this rook anymore. This one is nicely developed to the central file. And Leela continued now the attack with g4, offering a pawn in order to open the h file for an attack. If black takes here, then Leela has h5 and she can take here. And indeed, if black takes here, then Leela would love to play queen h2 and pick up that pawn with the queen and then try to mate, but it's not possible because this pawn on c3 is hanging, the queen and the bishop are still attacking it. But taking that pawn with the rook is just that good, and white has an attack. So after g4, instead of taking this pawn, Wasp played f6, sending that knight backwards. The knight cannot go to e6 because this pawn on d5 is pinned to the queen, the bishop could take it, and after pawn takes, bye-bye queen. So this is not possible. So after f6, this knight had to go back to h3, and now Wasp took on g4. But after Leela took back with the g-pawn, taking that pawn with the bishop is very, very dangerous because white has knight f4, and he's not only attacking g6, but the g-file opened up and the black king will be pretty soon cooked. So Wasp didn't take with the bishop here after f takes on g4. He preferred to attack Leela's center with e6, and this is a pretty good move because Leela doesn't really have options here. Obviously the pawn is pinned, so he cannot take, and c4 is also not an option because of knight b4. So Leela had to push the pawn forward. But as we'll see, this will prove to be pretty safe for white. Wasp now continued with queen a4, and he's attacking down this horizontal. And honestly, I would be scared to death in this position with white, but white is actually almost winning in this position, believe it or not. Here Leela played knight f2, conveniently defending these two. And now, since this pawn moved to d6 and c6 became available, this knight now reroutes to b8 and c6. And not only to c6, but it's going to e5. And it's hard to imagine a more beautiful outpost for the knight than the e5 square. The game continued now with h5. Leela, of course, is continuing her attack. Knight c6, and now instead of taking the pawn on g6, Leela preferred to play h6 and send this bishop back into the corner. And now she even got in h7, king f7. If the king goes to g7, then we transpose into the game, because now bishop h6 came, and here Wasp continued with knight e5. If he tries to save this rook with rook e8, then this backfires heavily on him, because the rook takes away now the e8 square from the king. And if we look carefully, then we see that there are no squares around this black king. And we can imagine then that if white plays here bishop e2 and castles, with this rook being on the f5, pinning the f6 pawn, all it takes a knight h3, knight g5 move, and black would be mated. So this looks very dangerous. And Wasp didn't even try to save that rook here. He played here knight e5, and now Leela continued with bishop e2. And at this point, Wasp doesn't like his king on the f file, and he played king e8. And he's also trying to save his rook by playing rook f7, but now Leela chopped off that rook, king f8, and now came queen h6 check, king f7. And finally, Leela considered that it's high time now to castle. Not only to put the king to safety, but also to place this rook on the f-file, where there will be a lot of action soon. The game continued now with bishop g7. Wasp wants to play rook h8 and pick up this pawn. Queen f4, rook h8, and now Leela continued her attack with g5. Now, allowing Leela to take here on f6 would be a big mistake, let's say after rook h7. Pawn takes, bishop takes, because there's knight d3, uncovering the queen and the rook. And after something like knight d7, defending this bishop, there's knight c5, attacking both the queen and the knight. And if the knight takes, then after queen f6, it's game over. King e8, queen takes on g6, king d7, rook h7, and white wins. So after g5, Wasp tried to close down the f-file, and he played here f5. But now came knight g4, attacking this knight twice and leaving no choice to Wasp. He had to take here. And now after bishop g4, Leela is planning to take here. For example, if rook takes now here on h7, then there's f takes on g5, also attacking this queen. And if now queen takes here, then there is the intermezzo f takes on e6 check. And after bishop takes on e6, there's rook f4 check, bishop f5, bishop takes, g takes on f5, rook f5 check, king e6, let's say, d7, the king has to take, rook f7 check, king back to e6, g5, rook h6, and rook takes on g7. And we can see that white is completely winning, being a rook up. So after bishop takes on g4 here, Wasp played king f8 to remove this king from a check, but Leela still went on with e takes on f5. Unbelievable idea. And now after queen takes on f4, he didn't take here the queen, because then after, let's say, e takes on f5, white is of course still winning, but it's much harder. Instead of taking the queen, she played now f takes on g6, giving up a rook, allowing Wasp now to take this rook on f1 if he wants it. But of course she's also making sure that this rook on h8 is inactive and cannot move, and she's also saving these two pawns. And if now the queen takes on f1, then white wins with rook f1 check, and after queen e8, the rook invades the 7th rank. That bishop on g7 has to go, and now white is threatening after rook e7 check, is threatening g7 with promotion. And now if the king goes to f8, then g7 comes, and if it goes to f8, then bishop h5. And again, Leela would be threatening g7 check, and after this bishop takes, there would be rook e8 mate. So the bishop has to go back to block that pawn, and now after rook f7, king e8, black loses the bishop, and with that the game. So after f takes on g6, instead of taking this rook, Wasp preferred to play bishop e5, and now Leela took the queen, bishop takes, and now after rook f1, this bishop on f4 of course will be also lost, because if e5, then Wasp loses the other bishop on c8. Wasp preferred to play king g7 and try to win some pawns. And now Leela took the bishop, and after king g6 she played bishop f3. She wants to play bishop e4 and win that rook on h7. Now if the king takes on g5, then Leela plays rook f7, defending this pawn on h7 and also threatening d7, and of course this would be also completely winning for white. After bishop f3 though, Wasp played rook h7, and now bishop e4 doesn't work immediately because Wasp has king g5 counterattacking Leela's rook, but Leela played here rook f8, attacking this bishop, and there's no time to save the bishop after something like bishop d7. Now bishop e4 wins the rook on h7, so Wasp preferred to take another pawn on g5, but now he loses the bishop, and after rook d7, rook c5 check, king f6, king f2, rook takes on d6. Leela is a piece up for a pawn, and this is now an easy win. And in the first phase of this ending, Leela is going towards the queen side to defend those pawns, and this is now what we'll see executed here. Bishop e2, rook g5, bishop d3, rook a5, and the king is going to the queen side. And now phase 2 is to win down this pawn on e6. She will attack that pawn frontally with the king and from behind with the rook, and she will block it with the bishop soon on e2. And here now rook e4 comes and the pawn will be lost. And now the first phase is to win down the remaining black pawns, after which, being a bishop and 2 pawns up, is a very easy game. And eventually Leela promoted both of her pawns to queens, and she gave them away, of course. But in the end, on move 166, she finally made it with a rook. In conclusion, a very nice attacking game by Leela here. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other games. Take care.